October 1973. Somewhere in a basement office at the Defense Intelligence Agency, an analyst is staring at a cable from Tel Aviv, and the numbers don't work. 7 M48 Patton tanks, American-designed, American-built, a platform the U.S. Army had been fielding since the Korean War era, held a defensive position on the Golan Heights against a Syrian armored assault numbering somewhere around 500 T-55s. The Syrians attacked in waves over roughly 24 hours. The 7 Pattons were still there when it ended. How does a force outnumbered roughly 70-1 survive first contact, let alone hold ground? Why did 500 Soviet-built tanks, backed by mechanized infantry and artillery, fail to overrun a position defended by a single-digit number of vehicles? What happened on that ridgeline that the Syrians themselves would later describe in terms closer to disbelief than tactical analysis? The answers sat buried in Israeli after-action reports for years. Some of the Syrian accounts took even longer to surface. Pieces of the story filtered out through military journals in the late 70s got a fuller treatment after certain Israeli records were partially declassified in the 80s, and the Syrian perspective, fragmented, often contradictory, almost never translated, trickled out through captured documents, prisoner debriefs, and a handful of memoirs published in Arabic that Western analysts mostly ignored for 2 decades. The full picture of what happened at the Valley of Tears on the Golan Heights is one of those battles that should be impossible to overlook, and yet most people have never heard of it. I'm putting together the complete account of this fight right now, and if you want to see how it ends, hit subscribe so you don't miss it. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and if you've read something about this battle that contradicts the official version, leave it in the comments. The DIA analyst's problem in October 1973 wasn't just the ratio. Ratios can be misleading. A dug-in defender on high ground with good fields of fire can punch well above weight. That's basic combined arms math, and every staff college teaches it. The Israelis had the terrain advantage on the Golan. The volcanic rock of the plateau created natural hull-down positions. The approaches from the east funneled Syrian armor into predictable avenues. All of that helps explain why the defenders performed well. None of it explains a 70-1 survival. The terrain advantage on the Golan was real, but the Syrians knew the terrain too. They'd lost it in 1967. They'd spent 6 years studying it, planning for exactly this attack. Syrian engineers had rehearsed breach operations against exactly these kinds of positions. Syrian officers had walked the ground. Their intelligence on Israeli fortification patterns along the Purple Line was detailed and largely accurate. This was not a force stumbling blind into unfamiliar country. The analyst would have also noticed something else in those early cables. The Israeli tank crews on the Golan were not elite units. The 7th Armored Brigade held the northern sector, and they were good. Regulars, experienced officers, solid training. But by the second day of fighting, the 7th Brigade's operational tank strength had been shredded. Crews were being pulled from damaged vehicles and stuffed into whatever Patton could still move and shoot. Reserve units, arriving piecemeal from the west, were thrown into the line with minimal coordination. One battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Avigdor Kahalani, would later describe the situation in terms that made clear he expected to die on that ridge. He wasn't being dramatic. He was doing arithmetic. The number of red icons on the Syrian side of his map versus the number of blue icons on his side produced a calculation with one logical outcome, and it wasn't the outcome that actually happened. Here's an interesting but probably irrelevant detail. The M48 Patton that the Israelis were using on the Golan had been re-engined. The original gasoline power plant, a Continental AV 1790 that ran on fuel so volatile American crews called the tank a Zippo, had been swapped out by the Israelis for a Continental AVDS 1792 diesel. The Israelis designated their version the Magach. Whether the diesel conversion mattered tactically in this specific engagement is debatable. A tank that doesn't catch fire as easily when hit is a tank whose crew might survive to fight again. But the Pattons at the Valley of Tears were getting hit by 100mm rounds from T-55s at ranges where engine type was less important than whether your turret was still attached. The conversion mattered more for logistics than lethality. What mattered was something the analyst couldn't see in the cables. Something that only became clear when the Syrian prisoner debriefs started coming in weeks later, and the interrogators began hearing the same word repeated by tank commanders from different brigades, different divisions, men who couldn't have coordinated their stories. 46,900 pounds. That's what the M48 Patton weighed combat loaded, and nearly every one of those pounds existed because American tank designers in the early 1950s were solving a single problem. How do you kill Soviet armor when the Soviets have more of it than you do? The answer wasn't to build more tanks. American industrial planners knew they'd never match Soviet production numbers in a European land war, not in the critical first weeks anyway. So, they designed a tank that could fight outnumbered and win from positions the enemy couldn't easily reach. The Patton was, from its first blueprint at the Detroit Arsenal tank plant in 1950, an exercise in making fewer better. The turret tells the story. The M48's cast turret was hemispherical, low profile, with a ballistic shape designed to deflect incoming rounds rather than simply absorb them. Soviet tank design in the same era favored a different philosophy. The T-55's turret was also rounded, but sat higher on the hull, because Soviet doctrine prioritized offensive speed over defensive posture. A T-55 was meant to attack in mass. An M48 was meant to sit in a hole in the ground with only its turret exposed, wait for those mass T-55s to enter a kill zone, and start working through them systematically. The American tank's gun depression told you everything about its intended purpose. The 90mm M41 cannon could depress to -9 degrees. The T-55's D-10 gun managed -4. 5 degrees doesn't sound like much until you realize it determines whether a tank can fire effectively from a reverse slope or a prepared fighting position on high ground. At -9 degrees, a Patton crew could tuck their hull behind a ridgeline, expose only the turret, the hardest part of the tank to hit and the best armored section, and engage targets in the valley below. At -4, a T-55 crew trying the same trick would find their gun pointed at the sky. Soviet designers knew this. They accepted the trade-off because their doctrine didn't envision needing it. Their tanks would be rolling forward, not hiding behind rocks. The M48's chief engineer, a Chrysler man named, and this detail has always struck me as perfect, nobody seems to have recorded his name in any of the unclassified program histories. The tank got famous. The man who shaped its turret didn't. One man whose name the records did preserve was Colonel Ben Shoham, commander of the 188th Armored Brigade, the Magach Brigade, which held the southern Golan sector adjacent to where the 7th Brigade fought. Shoham was a career armor officer who understood the Patton's hull-down advantage as well as anyone in the Israeli Defense Forces. He'd positioned his tanks accordingly. He would be killed on October 7, 1973, the second day of the war, when his command tank was hit by a Sagar anti-tank missile while he was moving between positions trying to coordinate a defense that was already collapsing around him. He was 31. His brigade was effectively destroyed. The southern Golan came within minutes of being completely overrun. Back to the engineering. The M48 that the Israelis fielded on the Golan had been upgraded beyond the original American spec in one critical respect, beyond the engine swap, the gun. Israel replaced the American 90mm with the British L7 105mm rifled cannon, the same weapon the U.S. Army would later adopt for its own M60 series. The L7 firing an armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot round could penetrate the T-55's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. The T-55's D-10 firing standard AP could penetrate the Patton's turret front at maybe 800 meters under ideal conditions. 700 meters of difference, the ballistic expression of two completely different ideas about how wars get fought. The Soviets built a gun meant to kill NATO tanks during a high-speed advance across the North German plain, engaging at close range after overwhelming the defense with numbers. The British and Americans built a gun meant to kill Soviet tanks at distance from prepared positions before those numbers could close the gap. On the Golan Heights in October 1973, the terrain compressed those doctrinal assumptions into a live-fire experiment. The volcanic basalt ridgelines gave the defenders exactly the hull-down positions American engineers had imagined 20 years earlier, and the long eastern slopes were precisely the engagement ranges British ballisticians had optimized the L-7 for: open ground, stretching out past 1,000 meters with nowhere to hide. The Syrians were about to drive straight into the scenario the M48 was born to fight. The basalt is black. Not dark gray, not charcoal. Black, the way cooled lava looks when it's been sitting undisturbed for a few 100,000 years. The Golan Plateau is essentially a volcanic shelf, tilted gently westward toward the Sea of Galilee, and the rock that covers it fractures into angular chunks with edges sharp enough to shred tank tracks. Israeli combat engineers who built the fighting positions along the Purple Line in the years after 1967 discovered something useful about this rock. It didn't need to be moved. It was already arranged by geology into natural berms and depressions that a Patton could back into with only minimal earthwork. The crews called these positions ramps. A tank would reverse up a slope of loose basalt until only its turret cleared the crest, fire, then roll forward and down into dead ground before the enemy could return accurate fire. The volcanic terrain did for free what NATO engineers in Germany spent millions constructing with reinforced concrete. The Valley of Tears, the Israelis called it Emek HaBacha, though it only received that name after the battle, runs roughly north-south through the northern Golan, a shallow depression maybe 4 kilometers wide flanked by ridgelines on both sides. From the eastern ridge, where Syrian armor would crest after crossing the Purple Line, the valley floor drops gradually before rising again to the western ridge, where Israeli positions overlooked everything below. The engagement geometry was almost absurdly favorable for the defender. A tank commander on the western ridge could see vehicles entering the valley at ranges of 2,000 meters or more, track them across open ground with zero concealment for over a kilometer, and engage them at optimal L7 range while they were still climbing the gentle slope toward his position. The valley floor offered nothing, no wadis deep enough to hide a tank, no tree lines, no structures. The Golan is treeless scrubland at that elevation, just black rock and brown grass and a long, exposed killing field that might as well have been designed by an instructor at Fort Knox. Brigadier General Raphael Eitan, who commanded the northern front, had walked this ground repeatedly before the war. Eitan was an infantryman by background, a paratrooper who'd fought in 1956 and 1967, and he understood terrain the way only someone who'd spent years moving through it on foot could. He'd positioned the 7th Brigade's tanks on the western ridge specifically because he recognized what the valley would become if the Syrians attacked in force. Eitan would go on to become IDF Chief of Staff in 1978, then enter politics, serving as Deputy Prime Minister. He died in 2004 at age 75, drowned at the port of Ashdod during a storm, a strange, almost absurd end for a man who'd survived decades of combat. Waves pulled him off a breakwater. They found his body in the water. Back to the valley. The terrain advantage was real, but it came with a critical limitation that gets overlooked in most accounts of the battle. The western ridge positions were excellent for engaging targets in the valley, but they were exposed from the flanks. If Syrian forces broke through on the southern Golan, which is exactly what happened when the Barak Brigade collapsed, the 7th Brigade's positions could be rolled up from below. Hull down only works when the enemy is in front of you. The crews sitting in those ramps on the afternoon of October 6, 1973, could feel the bombardment before they heard it. Syrian artillery preparation started with the ground vibrating through 46,000 pounds of steel, a low hum in the bones of the jaw, in the fillings of the teeth, before the sound caught up and became the rolling crack of hundreds of guns firing simultaneously from east of the ceasefire line. Dust rose off the basalt in sheets. Inside the turrets, loader rounds rattled in their racks. The clock started. The first Syrian shells landed long, overshooting the ramps by 200 meters, and the concussion hit the Patton hulls like a hammer on a drumskin, a deep metallic ringing that the crews felt in their chest cavities before their ears processed it as sound. Then the corrections came, and the world turned black with basalt dust. The 7th Brigade started October 6th with roughly 100 operational tanks spread across the northern Golan. By dawn on October 7th, that number was down to around 60. By the evening of October 8th, somewhere near 30, the Syrians kept coming. First, the 7th Infantry Division's armor, then elements of the 3rd Armored Division, then the Republican Guard, Assad's best, held in reserve for exactly this kind of committed push. Wave after wave cresting the eastern ridge, silhouetting themselves against the sky for just long enough. Kahalani's battalion bore the worst of it. His radio net shrank hour by hour. Tank call signs that had answered at dawn went silent by noon. Replacement crews arrived in half-tracks, sprinted to damaged Pattons that maintenance teams had somehow patched back into fighting condition and were engaging Syrian armor within minutes of climbing through the hatch. Some of these crews had never fired the L-7 in combat before. The after-action reports from the 7th Brigade note, in dry administrative Hebrew, that crew fatigue after 72 continuous hours of combat had degraded performance to a degree the brigade staff considered operationally critical. What that sentence actually meant was that men were hallucinating in their turrets. On the morning of October 9th, Kahalani commanded 7 tanks. The brigade as a whole had perhaps 20. Syrian reconnaissance elements were probing the western ridge from the south, where the Barak Brigade's sector had essentially ceased to exist. A fresh Syrian armored push was forming on the eastern ridge, probably 100 vehicles visible, with more behind the crest. Kahalani got on the radio to Brigade Commander Colonel Janosch Ben-Gal and reported his status in language that amounted to a final stand notification. Ben-Gal's response, relayed over an open net that every surviving crew in the brigade could hear, was 2 words in Hebrew. The gist, hold position. They held. The Syrian assault that morning broke against the western ridge for reasons that remained unclear to the Israelis themselves for weeks afterward. The T-55s and T-62s advanced into the valley, took fire from those 7 Pattons plus whatever else could still shoot, and then stopped, reversed. Withdrew east. 100 tanks turned around, 7 didn't. Why did they stop? The Israeli command couldn't answer that question on October 9th. They couldn't answer it on October 10th, when reserve armored brigades finally reached the Golan and began pushing the Syrians back across the Purple Line. The valley floor was carpeted with burned-out T-55s and T-62s. Estimates range from 260 to over 500 destroyed vehicles, depending on the source and how far east you count. And the sheer density of wreckage made movement difficult for the counterattacking Israeli columns. But wreckage alone doesn't explain why a force with overwhelming numerical superiority reversed course against 7 tanks. Burning hulks don't shoot back. The Syrians could see how few muzzle flashes were coming from that ridge. The debriefs started in late October. Israeli military intelligence processed, captured Syrian tankers through a systematic interrogation pipeline, and the transcripts, portions of which were eventually declassified and referenced in Hebrew-language military histories published through the 1980s and 90s, revealed something the Israeli tank crews on that ridge would have found bitterly funny if they'd known it at the time. The Syrian crews believed they were facing a much larger force than actually existed. It wasn't deception. It wasn't electronic warfare or dummy positions or any of the clever operational tricks that get taught in staff colleges. The Syrian tankers reported that every time they advanced into the valley, accurate fire began hitting them from positions they couldn't locate. They would lose 2 vehicles, then 4, then 6, and the fire seemed to come from everywhere along the western ridge simultaneously. Multiple captured officers from different battalions described the same phenomenon independently. The sense that the ridge was saturated with defenders firing from an interlocking network of positions that covered every approach. One Syrian company commander, captured on October 8th, told his interrogators that he estimated the Western Ridge held at least a brigade-strength force of 40 to 60 tanks based on the volume and accuracy of fire his unit received during a single approach. At the time of his capture, the actual number was probably around 15. What created this illusion was the ramp system. Kahalani's crews were doing exactly what the M48 was designed to do: reverse up a ramp, fire, roll forward into dead ground, reposition laterally along the ridge using terrain defilade, then pop up at a different ramp and fire again. A single Patton moving between 3 positions in 10 minutes looked, from the valley floor, like 3 separate tanks. The hull never appeared, just a turret, a muzzle flash, then nothing. Then another turret, 200 meters to the left. The Syrian gunners couldn't confirm kills because they never saw a hull to hit, and they couldn't count defenders because the same tanks kept appearing in different places. Soviet military advisors attached to the Syrian General Staff produced their own assessment after the war. The document, referenced in several Western analyses of Soviet lessons learned from the 1973 conflict, reportedly used the phrase defensive fire superiority to describe what the Patton crews achieved on the Golan, a clinical way of acknowledging that American tank design philosophy had performed exactly as intended against Soviet tank design philosophy in the precise conditions both sides had spent 20 years optimizing for. The Soviets absorbed this lesson with characteristic pragmatism. Within 5 years, the T-72's gun depression was increased, not to -9 degrees, but more than -4. The valley got its name from the Israeli crews who survived it. Emek HaBacha, the Valley of Tears. The name stuck because it described what the official reports couldn't. 4 days in a turret while friends burned in adjacent tanks. The radio net getting quieter every hour, nobody coming to relieve them because there was nobody left to send. Kahalani himself, decades later, spoke about the battle in language that was notably flat. Factual. He listed positions, ranges, vehicle counts. He described tactical decisions in the passive voice. He almost never talked about what he saw through his vision blocks during the long hours between Syrian assaults, when the valley floor was burning and the wind carried sounds that weren't mechanical. The DIA analyst in that basement office eventually got his explanation. The numbers worked after all. They just required a variable that didn't appear in any Soviet or American doctrinal manual: the mathematical relationship between terrain, engineering, hull defilade, and men who refused to leave. -9 degrees of gun depression. That was the number the Soviets fixated on after 1973. Their T-72 could manage about -5 at the time, and the classified after-action assessments made clear this wasn't a minor ergonomic shortcoming. It was a design philosophy that had just gotten several hundred Syrian tankers killed. So they improved it. Turret geometry was redesigned on the T-80. Hull defilade tactics were studied and incorporated into Warsaw Pact training manuals. By the early 1980s, Soviet armored doctrine had quietly absorbed almost every tactical lesson the Valley of Tears could teach. The Americans, meanwhile, took the same data and ran in a different direction entirely. The Golan validated something the Army had been arguing about internally for a decade: that a smaller force equipped with superior optics, superior ammunition, superior crew training, and better tactical communications could defeat a numerically dominant armored assault if the engagement conditions favored precision over mass. This wasn't theory anymore. It was a body count on a volcanic plateau. The M1 Abrams program, already in development, received a burst of institutional confidence that smoothed over budget fights and congressional skepticism. The tank that emerged incorporated every advantage the Patton had demonstrated on the Golan: gun depression, fire control, crew survivability, ammunition stowage, and added thermal imaging, a 1,500 horsepower turbine engine, Chobham composite armor. Quality over quantity, industrialized. 18 years later, in February 1991, the M1A1 Abrams met the T-72 in the Iraqi desert. The engagement at 73 Easting lasted about 23 minutes. Captain H.R. McMaster's Eagle Troop destroyed 28 Iraqi tanks, 16 personnel carriers, and 39 additional vehicles. American losses were one badly damaged. The T-72's improved gun depression didn't matter because the Iraqis weren't fighting from prepared positions on volcanic ridgelines. They were dug into flat desert sand, which is a fundamentally different problem. The Soviets had spent 2 decades engineering a counter to the Golan scenario specifically, and the next war happened somewhere else, on different terrain, under different conditions. Doctrine is always a solution to the previous catastrophe. There's an unrelated detail in the declassified DIA file on the Valley of Tears that has nothing to do with gun depression or tank design. A footnote. It mentions that among the captured Syrian equipment recovered from the valley floor, Israeli intelligence found several T-62s with factory-fresh interiors, vehicles delivered from Soviet stockpiles less than 6 months before the war, still smelling of packing grease. The serial number plates had been filed down. Moscow apparently didn't want direct evidence of how recently they'd armed the assault. The filing was sloppy. You could still read the numbers underneath. Somewhere in the DIA building in late 1973, an analyst typed up a final assessment of the Golan engagement, noted the serial number discrepancy in a classified annex, and forwarded the file to a division chief who was already working on the next crisis. He probably took the elevator to the parking lot, drove home on the Beltway, and never thought about those serial numbers again.